So, Karah, tell us about the election of 1828.
Well, you see, we got the same main candidates as last time. We got John Quincy Adams and the great Jackson. You see, last time, Jackson was not happy with the outcome of the election of 1824. He called corrupt bargain. He was like, okay, Clay is helping Adams get into presidency so that he can have a better chance at presidency later. So this is not okay. But so that has been creating some grinding of gears.
Some friction.
some friction, yes. There's been some friction between those two. They really don't like each other at all. Adams and Jackson, that is. And thus, this was one of the filthiest campaigns in history. There was a ton of mudslinging, and they're just playing dirty. They just went wild. And that crazy campaigning got Jackson the presidency. So his second time around, he did pretty well. And so Andrew Jackson brings this new guy to presidency. Because you see, the first 6 before him were pretty pretentious. Like, let's be honest, they're all like, we're just so cool. But Jackson, he really believes he is the embodiment of the common man. He believes that if something isn't going his way, it's not going the common man's way. He grew up on the frontier, but he was also the richest man in Tennessee. So he really just spanned across all factions. He was a pretty amazing guy, really. Although he was relatively uneducated. And he really liked to get into fights, and he'd even killed a couple men in duels. So there's some questionable content there. But well, yes. See, because of he liked to fight, that kind of led him. That leads us to believe that he was a man of action. Wasn't much of a thinker. He was really living in the moment. But despite some of his flaws, he was the most popular man in America.
So, Karah, Jackson was really well known for the spoils system. What is that?
Well, so the spoils system is when one person, wants to get somewhere in politics, and he's like, oh, hey, let's ask this other person to get some help, and then I'll give that person help later so that they can further their political career, such as the corrupt bargain that we talked about just recently. And so it's based on loyalty. So Jackson was really a firm believer in it. He was all gung-ho for that. And yeah, his gung-ho-ness made him use it quite extensively, which leads him to his cabinets. He had his kitchen cabinet, and it was this close-knit group who were known for using the back door, or the kitchen door, where they get their name. So this closer-knit group came about because of the spoils system. And then Martin Van Buren, who was Secretary of State Jackson's first term and Vice President Jackson's second term, was a part of both the kitchen cabinet and the regular cabinet. Because And as we know, Secretary of State and Vice President are both stepping stones to presidency. So Van Buren was just right up there, prepared.
So as an A-pusher, you immediately associate Jackson with Indian removal. Why do we associate him with that?
Well, you see, he was a strong supporter of Indian removal. And he is the most associated with it, despite the fact that he wasn't even the president who put the Indian removal law into effect, nor during his presidency did the Trail of Tears happen. And that event is what we most associate with Indian removal, and yet that didn't happen until he was out of office. So it's kind of weird, but just because Jackson was so excited, to say the least, about moving America forward and like getting expansion, and he's just really for that, and his support for the Indian removal was not racial hatred or anything like that. He was just really for the common man, and the common man wanted to move west, and so he was like, we need to move west.
So in 1828, there was a pretty abominable tariff issued. What was it, and how did people receive it?
So you're talking about the Tariff of Abominations, so-called. It was an extremely high duty on raw materials. And it was directed towards keeping commerce within the United States. But the South had a problem with this because they were already in the minority, and they had commerce with other countries selling their cotton. And this was going to raise prices, and they were worried other countries were going to have a problem with their prices and raise their prices. And they thought it was just like trying to get at the South, and so that they thought the North was just gonna, like, it was like for the North, like against the South. And they were not happy, to say the least. Really, they were freaking out. So they called it the Tariff of Abominations because it was just, they thought it was that awful. And there was an anonymously published essay that attacked the tariff, and it advocates states' rights so that the South has their say. But it turns out that the writer of this anonymous essay was John C. Calhoun, Jackson's vice president. And it's like, that's questionable. It's like, the vice president should not be going against the president. And so it was a little rough patch.
So what was leading up to the Ordinance of Nullification of South Carolina?
So there was a large debate about states' rights, where Daniel Webster from the North and Robert Hayne were debating about states' rights. And Robert Hayne, being the South Carolinian Southern man he is, he's all about states' rights and how the South needs, like, to have their rights and they can do what they want to. And he would hope that, like, that Jackson would side with the South because he's a states' rights guy. But Jackson is more so a nationalist. And so the debate got pretty heated.
So what was the actual ordinance?
So South Carolina passes this ordinance of nullification because there's this new tariff the tariff of 1832, and they had a problem with it, and so they refused to collect this tax, and but Congress is like, no, you have to, and so they pass a force bill, and they authorize the president to use military force to collect the tariff. And so that causes quite a large problem, and the state and federal governments are then they're like prepared to fight each other, and it's like, whoa, okay, let's slow down here, and so a compromise tariff is enacted through Calhoun, Jackson, and Clay, and this tariff provides a gradual reduction of the tariff of 1832 over 10 years. So it's like there's still a tariff, but it's going to decrease. So it's like, okay, that's a little better. And so then South Carolina repeals the nullification ordinance, but just to show how tenacious they are, they want to get in the last word. And so on the same day they repealed the nullification crisis, they also nullified the Force Act, the bill that forced the original tariff to be enacted.
So what is Jackson's deal with the National Bank?
So the National Bank is supported by the Eastern elitists, and it is due for a recharter during Jackson's presidency. And Jackson is totally against the National Bank, and he famously says, "The bank, I'll kill it," and he starts the bank war. Jackson withdraws federal funds from the National Bank and redistributes them into state banks, and just so that the National Bank doesn't really have a purpose, because originally its purpose was to hold federal funds. But Jackson's like, no, nice try. And so the immediate result is economic prosperity for the country. And however, he kind of screwed over the country later in the Panic of 1837, which wasn't during his presidency. But this just shows how much of a take action sort of guy Jackson was. He wasn't really thinking about the future. But he doesn't have to worry about the eventual recession, because that falls into Van Buren's lap. But Jackson thinks he's succeeded. So
There was a new political party that formed during this time period called the Whig Party. Can you explain on that?
Yeah. So Jackson totally dominated presidency, and this domination created a lull in the two-party political system, and there was an obvious political party in power, which was the Democratic Party. And however, when a party is in such like power and is so dominant, there is never smooth going, because people start getting really riled up and there's no peace and they like feud, and so all of these different opinions going on in this dominant party created the Whig Party. And the Whig Party was weird though, because it had so many different factions that they didn't seem to be related. Like, the only thing that held them together was opposition to Jackson. But this opposition puts 4 men in the White House. So I'm not sure how much they were doing right, but I guess they figured out that if they had that one thing in common. So, and it might be a misconception, but the Whig Party was not a third party political party. It was one of the 2 major parties at the time. So the good part of the Whig Party was that they had some really great resources for wealth and talent because of the very smart people who were in the Democratic Party beforehand. And there are plenty of connections with the intellectuals and the wealthy, and mostly the North, including Clay Calhoun and Webster, the great triumvirate. And yeah, so they aligned themselves with the Whigs at one point or another. However, the problem with the Whig Party was their opposition to Jackson. One thing that held them together also was a bit of their downfall, because then they have opposition to everything Jackson believes and represents. And since Jackson represents the common man, the Whig Party is kind of this like hulking figure that's like I don't know if I want to be like with the Whig Party because they don't represent my rights as a common man, you know? And so that's a really large political obstacle that the Whig Party has to get over in order to get men into the White House.
So what was the Supreme Court Worcester versus Georgia case?
So Georgia has this Cherokee land section, and it's the Cherokees, but Georgia's well, we want that land, so yeah, you should get out of here. But the Cherokees obviously don't want to give up their land, and Georgia, expecting the president to support them, goes to the Supreme Court, and they have this case about whether or not Georgia has the right to this land. And it's decided by Judge John Marshall that Georgia does not have any right to this land, which is upsetting for the Georgians, and they're like, why doesn't Jackson support us? But Jackson just says, John Marshall has made his decision, and he doesn't really elaborate on that.
In 1836, there was an election, and the man Martin Van Buren was elected. Tell us about his presidency.
So, well, in the election of 1836, the Whigs tried to run several parties, so several candidates for their party, so that they might throw off the majority, because the Democrats are still the leading party, and they only have their one main candidate, Van Buren. And so the Whigs try this strategy to throw the majority off and to send the election to the House. But this is a sorry strategy, and Van Buren is able to just coast right into the White House. And so Van Buren, as president, he was a pretty good politician, but he's really not a very good president. He didn't have any major opinions, and even though you don't want to be on the totally extreme side like Alexander Hamilton, you also want to at least have a side so that you have some supporters, you know? But he couldn't make any decisions pertaining to important matters of that time. but so there's nothing really major that he did, like he attributed, that could be attributed to him for the country. However, the Trail of Tears did happen during his presidency, and this is reminding us of Indian removal, most associated with Jackson, but enacted by John Quincy Adams. So, but the Trail of Tears is the epitome of what we think of when we think of Indian removal. And this was when 15,000 Cherokee Indians were forcibly removed from their land, and 4,000 die on this trail. And so that did happen during Martin Van Buren's presidency, which is it's a pretty sad event. But
So a tradition we still have today was started around the time of 1840, and that was the modern election. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the election of 1840, or the Log Cabin Campaign, was Van Buren against the Whigs again. The Whigs this time have their candidate William Henry Harrison. And their Log Cabin Campaign was, they were showing that Harrison is this great frontiersman who was a military leader, and he fought the frontier Indians, and he's just this really great guy, and he like appeals to the common man. And then Van Buren is this like suave higher up who eats off of gold plates and is like, he is like so kingly, and he and so this campaign idea is it works. Harrison does get elected, and it's one of the first showings of our modern election, with all of the campaigning and the excitement and slogans and like comparing one person to another and like making one person sound better than the other, and all of this fanfare gets an 80% voter turnout, and so Harrison as president did not last long. He has the shortest term for president, which is 1 month, because in his inaugural address he talked for 2 hours in like terrible weather, and he gets pneumonia, and then he dies. And so that was really that was just a bad decision on his part. He definitely should have just probably taken out like his whole, like almost more than half of his speech, because that was just ridiculous. And so then everyone's like, so our president was just elected, and now what are we gonna do? And like nowadays it would be obvious, we're like, oh, he's the vice president. But at that time it was like, well, I mean, does he actually have to be elected in, or like, is he just going to be acting president until we find somebody else? And so there are all these questions. But then it is decided that the vice president will become the actual president of the United States. And the vice president of Harrison was John Tyler. Many of his critics called him his accidency, and another name for him was the president without a party. Because was he a Dem or was he a Whig? I don't know. He kind of sided with ideas from both parties, so he But then he also managed to alienate both parties by not siding with either one of them. So he kind of made for a less than good president, but he tried his best, even though he was a worshiper of consistency, which doesn't make for a particularly good leader. And another little fact about him was that he was the only president to later serve in the Confederacy. So it also leads for some questionability about him, but you know, he tried. So we've got Jackson as a young boy in his Tennessee town with a British general who thinks he's better than everyone. You there? You boy, come here. Clean my shoes. And so Jackson, even as a youngin', being the bold person he is, says, "You can kiss my ass." The consequences of that snide remark by the young Jackson was that the British officer sliced Jackson right across his cheek, and he carried that scar for the rest of his life. Thanks for watching The Era of Jackson.